Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the Table. We discuss issues of God and culture. I'm Darrell Bock, Executive Director for Cultural Engagement at the Hendrick Center at Dallas Theological Seminary, and I have two very distinguished guests with me today. Brian Carter, Senior Pastor at the Concord Church here in Dallas, and Jeff Warren, who's Senior Pastor at Park Cities Baptist Church. And they've got a wonderful story to tell us about the way in which their ministries work and have come together to a certain degree. And so I'm going to start with you, Brian. Tell us a little bit about how did you get to be Senior Pastor at Concord Church? What's your background that prepared you for ministry?
Well, I'm a native of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and entered ministry as a teenager, had a heart for ministry, and then went off to school. Most of the pastors I knew were bivocational, so I was going to be a school teacher, a principal, and a pastor.
Oh, wow.
Graduated from Oklahoma State, moved to Dallas, and then went to Dallas Seminary, got on staff at a local church, Concord Church, and not long thereafter, the founding pastor, Dr. E.K. Bailey, would invite me to be his assistant and successor. And so for now, 12 years, I've been there serving faithfully and having a time in my life serving God's people.
That's great. And have you been senior pastor for how long?
Been senior pastor for 12 years.
So you've been at Concord longer
for
than
15, 16, since 2000.
Wow.
Since 2000.
Wow. Okay, very good. And Jeff, what's your pedigree? What's your story?
Yes. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Okay.
I felt a calling into ministry while I was in school. I was at East Carolina University, where I was played a little soccer, and I was an art major, if you can believe that.
Wow, okay.
And so we talk often about the art of the sermon, the art of leadership and such. But came out here and right out of seminary, went to Park Cities to be the youth pastor, actually. And then from there, after about, 8 years, I was the youth minister, then became young adult pastor, and then ultimately over all married adults, associate pastor ultimately under Jim Dennison. Dr. Dennison was there, and served with him for about a year. Then went up to First McKinney, where I served for 11 years as pastor there, and thought I was going to retire there. And then the Lord called us back to Park Cities, where I've been the senior pastor since September 2001. 5 years I've been there.
And so Park Cities is a Southern Baptist church, right?
Right.
And where did you do your seminary training?
Yeah, I went to Southwestern back in the day.
That's
Interesting.
Okay. We can
yeah, right?
That.
But hey, we have BTS ministers on our staff.
Yeah, there you go.
We send folks here as well.
Yeah, we sneak into all kinds of strange places.
Well, hey, shout out to all my, the Southern Baptists. My grandfather, who was the pastor in Charlotte, First Charlotte for a while, was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention back when I was, probably before I was born, but anyway, yeah. So you asked about pedigree. There you go.
I love Baptist churches because you say first, what is it? First in Charlotte, and I'm going, it's First Baptist Church in Charlotte. Right.
First Methodist.
There's only one church, right?
Yeah.
So that's great. Well, we're glad to have both of y'all with us, and I think I want y'all to tell us a story of how your ministries have touched base with each other, and kind of just to set the context for this. I was thinking of, what passage could I possibly mention that kind of set up the conversation? And I was thinking of the wonderful passage in Ephesians 2:11-22 that talks about the reconciliation that Jesus Christ brings, not just between individuals and God, but between peoples.
Yes.
And a wonderful, terrific passage. And reconciliation is one of Paul's favorite words for what grows out of the gospel. So you guys are a living illustration of that. And Brian, I think I'll let you start us on how in the world did you guys end up ministry side by side. I forgot to ask you one question, though, and that is Concord. Tell a little bit about its pedigree. We've mentioned that Jeff's at a Southern Baptist church.
So Concord's a Baptist church. We changed our name several years ago in that kind of season, but historically our roots are deeply rooted in the Baptist church. And our church is in the southern part of Dallas. Was founded nearly 40 years ago, and just built around being a healthy church based on Acts chapter chapter 2 and fulfilling the Great Commission.
Well, that's great.
The theme of our church is we grow people. And we try our whole focus is around people growing people by connecting them with their next step with Christ.
Oh, that's great.
So it's a joy to watch us try to serve in the community, which is a big part of who we are, as well as helping people to move toward maturity in Christ.
Right. That's great. Okay. So I've got you and Jeff here. So why are you and Jeff here?
So we're here because our churches were connected by both of our predecessors. That's how it originally started. They had a friendship and a kinship some 15 years ago. And so when the two of us began our ministries, people kept saying, y'all need to know each other. So we met, we connected.
So you inherited this relationship.
A little bit. I think there was a time, a season when there was a gap there. And even back when I was over men's ministry at a time when I was at Park Cities previously, and we did some things even before E.K. Bailey had left pastor, passed away at that point. But so there's some history there for me. But I was told, Jeff, if there's any church that kind of mirrors or a leader in the southern sector of our city that kind of mirrors you, and I think you have a lot in common, would be Brian Carter. So we started getting involved in a thing called Movement Day here in Greater Dallas.
Yeah, sure.
And became real central to that. And it was through that we really came to know each other. I think it all started with the lunch.
So the reconnect is actually relatively recently. Am I
probably the last 2 to 3 years? Last 2 to 3 years.
Because as you said, you've been senior pastor for 12 years, and you're 5.
That's right.
Predecessors, I take it, are E.K. Bailey and Jim Dennison. Do I have that right? Okay.
Right.
So they established the relationship, and it. I'm hearing echoes of experience that I had. We partnered with a church down the road from us. I went to Trinity Fellowship in Richardson with a predominantly African-American church down the road from us, and it went well for about a year and a half, and then it just kind of slowly, because everybody gets busy, drifted away, and we never recovered from it. So it's cool to hear that you guys reconnected. So talk a little bit about that phase of things. You've had the relationship, but it was there, and you got together. Is it Movement Day that spurred it on, or was it?
It was Movement Day, and then just us spending time together. So we had lunch, and then the unique thing that happened was the Trayvon Martin, Ferguson, all these dynamics begin to hit the national news.
Eric Gardner, Brown, then even the Oklahoma,
and then we begin to have a conversation. What happens if that comes to Dallas?
Okay.
How does Dallas respond to something? And we begin to realize how divided we were.
Interesting.
And so around that conversation, we begin to say, okay, how does the church respond? How should we be preparing for these matters that are happening across the country? But how should the church respond? So we begin talking about that. And around that conversation, we then begin to host roundtables with pastors. He brought 5 to 10 white brothers. I brought 5 to 10 black brothers, and we'd sit around tables at lunch having conversations around what does racial reconciliation look like?
Oh, that's great.
How is racism evident in the city of Dallas? What is your experiences? And so around these tables, pastors are telling their stories, and we're entering each other's worlds as we have conversations about. And so some pastors are saying, okay, how do you address it? And some are saying, I don't talk about those kind of issues at my church. Others are saying, it's a regular part of my and so you've got all these dynamics in a room, and so we have a few of these round tables just talking, and then out of that, the Movement Day began to challenge us to say, what would happen if you guys, why don't y'all think about swapping pulpits? And so we said, okay. And so me and Jeff, we decided, okay, now let's take a next step. We've been talking about it. So last Palm Sunday, not this year, but 2015, we swapped. And so on Palm Sunday, he's at my church with his praise team. I'm at his church with my choir.
No, I bet that was exciting.
Oh, man. It's incredible. So, what really, what triggered it, as we became friends, and that's going to be the common theme here, is, you've heard, the gospel travels at the speed of relationships.
Right.
And for us, that's been really a theme. I mean, I tell people, I love Brian Carter. I like him. He's my brother. I love being with him. I'm encouraged by him. And so we were just prior to coming in this room, we were sharing some of the woes and challenges, and hey, what you been up to today? So we encourage each other. We had lunch, a week ago. I mean, we get together regularly. But when Ferguson went down, that was the thing that for us we said, not so much what if, but when. That happens in Dallas. Are we ready for this? And is the faith community ready to rise up and to speak into it? And we determined we can't do so if we don't know each other.
Right.
And so we've got to know each other. So that started with us, but then we realized we needed to share the love, as it were, and get some more brothers together. And that was the series of meetings we had. We then had another meeting down in really the southern sector at a church there in had gosh, I don't know how many, 50,
probably 50 to 60
or
pastors.
So more pastors come to just get more and more involved. We'd have discussions around the tables, fascinating conversations.
Yeah, well, we're going to come back to that because that's an important part of the conversation. You remind me of a conversation that we've had at the Hendricks Center. We had a Hispanic pastor and an Anglo pastor call us about 9 months ago, went out to eat, and their concern was basically the same. They lived in Mesquite, and they said, we've been looking at what's been going on around the country, and we've gotten to know one another, and we're encouraging, and we're actually talking to the police department about what happens if this explodes, and how can we not respond as some law enforcement have responded, that kind of thing, to keep this from something like this from happening and blowing up our community. So it's not an isolated conversation by any means. Right. It's an important one. So let's talk this area, to be honest, really scares some people for different reasons. And so in one sense, for African-American community, it's a difficult discussion, and for the Anglo community, it's a different discussion. So you put everybody in the same room at the same time. I bet that's a pretty interesting deal. I guess my first question is, what kind of efforts did you make, or did you make any efforts to kind of build some initial trust before you walked into all this sensitivity, sensitive discussion?
I think so. I'd say this real quick, that in terms of trust between the two of us, again, it just takes time. And that's where a pastor has to decide with issues that are larger than what he's dealing with on a regular basis in his church. We all got enough to say grace over in our place, right? So you've got to decide, I'm going to spend about 10% of my time or so outside in leadership in the community, in the city. Right. Brian does this in big ways. I seek to be involved in a lot of ways as well. We were invited to this Operation Blue Shield with the police department to speak about issues. So we've been, it's been great that it's opened doors for us. But the initial thing for us was in regard to just pastor to pastor. He came and spoke during the Lenten season. I came. We came together for some citywide prayer initiatives that we had. So we really started to get to know each other, see each other publicly, preaching and such. So on a personal level, there was trust built. And then I think with the pastors, again, just to get them together to spend time together is how you build trust, get to know each other.
And part of it is he used his credibility with the pastors he knew. I used mine. And so they were taking a risk. I mean, they're entering this room.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they don't know each other. Right. And they're at these tables, but we both, lended all we could to say, okay, this is, I think when the national context was so vivid and so powerful that someone had to say something. And so I think, and there was some apprehension. I mean, you could see some guys, being very reserved. You could see some, and so they're trying to nap. And then sometimes there's some theological differences. I mean, there's all kinds of dynamics happening. Right. Culturally, both in the church, both in the city. I mean, just trying to work through, okay, is it really still alive? Is race? And they say, yes, I was at this mall and this is what happened. And so you're hearing these, just trying to understand one, and in many cases, just ignorance. So what happens when you're pulled over? How do you feel? How do you feel when you're pulled over? And just talking through these kind of scenarios were helpful, I believe, because it allowed us just to get a broader context than what we're just seeing in the news.
And another thing that we've been very involved with here on our campus is that we've had two what are called privilege walks for our students, in which we get them to probe the differences in backgrounds that people come to seminary with, that kind of thing.
Fantastic.
That's good. And there, it's an interesting exercise because some people really appreciate the fact that we have it.
Sure.
Some people really are not happy that we're doing it.
Sure.
But we feel like if I'm going to get people to think about what it is, who their neighbor is, and how they're going to love their neighbor, and how they're going to engage with their neighbor, then these are important, frank conversations to have. And frankly, if we can't have them in the church, we've got so much in common, then where are we going to have them?
We're in trouble.
That's right.
So, let's talk a little bit. So I'm pulling you through the story here. So you've got these pastors together. You've each played your trust card with the crew that you brought in. You lay out on the table the topic, among other things, is going to be racism. And whether racism still exists, which I can assume is not an easy topic to raise with a group of guys just meeting each other. And what hurdles did you have to overcome?
I think one on the white side, and let me back up to say, our churches, we both come from very large churches, and our church is white. I mean, it's white, right? We have a Hispanic, portion of our congregation in Espanol.
The street's even almost white going by your church.
I think that's right. So we, we kind of, but there's some levity there. We joke about that. There's some humor in the midst of it all. But I'm telling you, in a lot of white churches, it seems there is this sense that racism is not an issue.
Right.
And then you watch the, television, and you realize, wait, maybe that's a problem somewhere. And there's an underlying issue that people must address, and it's a gospel issue. You referenced, the Ephesians 2. Paul said that Christ has broken down in his own flesh the dividing wall, and clearly that's our sin. But Brian and I see it as a core gospel issue, and the church has got to lead the way. We've said the love of Christ compels us, and the gospel is the reason and the motivation. So what we did find, answer your question, is I think there was a high motivation on the part of the pastor.
That's why you show up at something.
Oh, man, they got there and said, we're all in. And then it went beyond our expectations, I think. That's not to say that it wasn't difficult. You start to discover that white privilege is a real thing. It's not talked about.
Right.
You have no idea the privilege that you had as a white person.
What you take for granted as being a given in life is not a given for everybody.
That's right.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, that's right. And to watch the news and we only get clips of something happening, and it's so good. And to have Scripture as the backdrop, right? The truth that guides us among men who love one another and love the Lord.
So. Okay. Well, Brian, from your angle, when this went out on the table, I can imagine a couple of things. One is even the decision to speak to this from an African-American perspective to an audience full of white pastors is quite a move. So talk about the hurdles as you see them and how you tried to negotiate them.
I think one of the aims, one of the things I appreciate about Jeff is just his willingness to help partner with me in this conversation. I think a lot of times when an African-American pastor or church does it alone, you don't gain the ground. Sometimes it can be misinterpreted. But by his partnership, it gave a voice to it.
So he's like hacking away at the vegetation in the room, creating space for the conversation.
It gives us because it doesn't happen often. It's not often that we're willing to step in the way he has, and so that helped so much to help deal with some of the barriers. And then not only that, but then just, I think as he mentioned, I think there was a readiness that was in the room. I mean, I think when you saw the marches, when you saw Black Lives Matter, all these dynamics happening, and then you begin to present what is the church's role in all of this, it just seemed as though genuinely there was a readiness. Now, there's some skepticism about does this really mean anything? Will anything come of this?
Right.
There's some of that in the room. But at the same time, there's a hopefulness. There's a thread of hope that perhaps we're on to something. Perhaps this can really help us to move forward. And so, it was worth the risk. But I think at the same time, I don't think I realized just the differences that were in that room. Because it's not just, like I said before, it's not just color.
Right.
It's theologically, it's denominationally.
Right.
You got all these dynamics in the room.
Right.
Just how they view the church. And so, but it was worth it. It was worth it having those candid conversations to help us move forward and help us think more broadly about the gospel.
Okay, I'm going to take a shot at this. We don't have a whole lot of time before the break, but I'm going to take a shot at this. I'm going to ask you a difficult question, but I think it's an important question. It's a question I actually asked Tony Evans at the beginning of a podcast we did months ago about the same topic, and it goes like this. What is it that Anglos don't get about being African American in the United States? You laugh, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. Wow. I guess primarily, kind of building on what was mentioned before about white privilege, just the realities that we face every single day. That although slavery and the civil rights movement, all those things have happened, it does not mean that the playing field is now level. And some of the remnants of those 400 years and 60, those remnants still live long after that are played out every day in our lives. So regardless of how progressive things have become, I think often Anglo-Americans don't understand the dynamic, the challenges, the realities that we face every single day. That racism is something I can't get beyond it. I mean, it's my everyday reality. I have to view the lens through the fact that whether it's the educational space, whether it's my professional career, whether it's where my kids go to school, whether it's the neighborhood we live in, all of these dynamics shape us and in many cases limit us in terms of us really achieving what would be so-called the American dream. I mean, there are dynamics
there's a reality, if I can try and describe this in different words, there's a reality in which African Americans or any minority, this would be true of any minority, I think, has to accommodate itself to the larger culture in a way that people who are part of the majority culture don't have to accommodate themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that makes a difference. Another difference, this is one of the ones that Tony mentioned that I found fascinating. He looked at me and he said, how often have you been pulled over going through a neighborhood just because of the color you skin? You didn't do anything. You're just being pulled over. And, it didn't take me long to go through that question.
Sure.
That's never happened. And so we don't even see how some of this works.
No, so when I go to school, I have to not only be able to get a degree, but I also have to get a degree in understanding white culture. It's mandatory for me. In order to be successful or have some type of, I have to understand the culture as much as I do any other academic pursuit that I have.
Let me ask you another question that won't be easy. I'm glad we got time for this one, and it goes like this. What's one thing, I won't say the one thing, what's one thing that Anglos need to hear that they may not want to hear, but it's important that they get about the African American experience in our culture? I'm majoring the hard question. Your time's coming, by the way.
I guess an appreciation for the story. They have to value our story, and not think that because of the progress that story is accomplished or fulfilled, but they have to understand just the reality of that story, that the plight of where African American men face with so many being incarcerated, the low rate from college grad. I mean, these are dynamics, the impact of poverty on our community. They have to really understand and appreciate the story.
And the history of even how that cycle got started, which most people don't even, I would say most Anglos don't even think about. They don't think about the fact that African American family units were broken up by default. And so functioning without a family unit was not a given. Right.
And so the threads and roots of those issues still remain. I mean, the impact of mass incarceration the last 20 to 30 years. And so I think it's understanding the story. So I think when white Americans understand the story and value the story, then that allows us to be able to that's so important to understanding us. When they view us as an exception to the rule because we've had some level of success, or categorize what they see on TV and say, look at those young men, then I think it hinders us from really having the relationships we ought to have, or the reconciliation. Because reconciliation can never happen without an appreciation and valuing the other person. And valuing the other person means valuing your story, your history, in terms of where you've come from. And so I think stepping into that space and even asking questions, helping people to understand, all of that is crucial to be able to get where we need to be.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's good.
Jeff, it's your turn. Okay. Here's the question for you, and that is, you've done some work in this area, and I'm sure you've learned some things in the midst of doing it. But what's something you would say, and it's a twofold question. First, to the Anglo community about why this is a valuable discussion and what they need to get out of it. And then secondly, what would you flip the question? What would you say to an African-American audience about where the white community comes from on this? So so I'll let you pick it in whatever order you want.
I'll answer the first one with kind of a story and jump on what Brian's been talking about. During when the Black Lives Matter movement came about, I posted some things after Eric Garner was, after he died, and posted with some hashtag Black Lives Matter, knowing what I was going to get. And it happened. People started responding, all lives matter. And immediately I'm thinking, you missed the point. The point being that you white people, and this is where I'm helpful, I think, for Brian, I can speak to you white people, right, in a way that maybe he can't in some ways. So in my position, I can say, listen, you don't know what it's like to grow up in a culture where you think people are questioning whether your life matters or not. That's the black experience. That perhaps some people are questioning whether my life matters. And most of us white people we've never had that experience. So I took, for instance, one of the things we did with my staff, I took my ministerial staff to Selma, the movie, when it came out a year ago or so. And I remember sitting, then we debriefed afterwards, talked about it, which I challenge every pastor, leader to do. I think for white people to see the story again, if we don't see it, if we don't learn from someone like a friend like I have in Brian and others, if we don't read a lot, you can watch. And what I remember was they showed the scenes in Selma at night when the riots were started or broken up. I mean the marches, I should say, police coming in, and they were exactly the same pictures that we're seeing on the news presently of Ferguson and other places. I mean, look exactly like Ferguson. And see, in the black mind, from generation to generation, or just a couple of generations, that's their story. That's not the white man's story. That is in the thread and the DNA of a black person's experience. And so to step into that story, as Brian said, is so important for white people to recognize that there's been a different story for the African American. And I would say this too, that's been helpful for me to read. Most white pastors don't realize that the letter from the Birmingham jail, Dr. King's letter, was to me. It was to the white man who was deciding, let's don't get involved, to the moderate white who said, I'm going to stay out of this. And he was calling him out. And so I would challenge all white pastors to read his letter. But back to your question, I think the thing that I have learned so much through this time, because again, as a white man, I didn't grow up with this kind of oppression and kind of racism that many have experienced. So
now, what would you say to an African American who is trying to understand you and to some and perhaps to some degree the Anglo community that seems splintered in its reaction, if I can say it that way? There are some people who are sensitive. There are some people who want to just sit on the sidelines. There certainly are other people who are bothered by the fact that we're even having the conversation. Sure. So what would you say to This is your chance.
Well, to the black,
to the African American about
Yeah.
the mixture of Anglo reaction.
Yeah. Okay, well, one thing I said from his pulpit recently, in light of one of the craziest political seasons I think we've ever seen in our country.
Yeah, that's a whole nother podcast. We're not going to now.
But I referenced that. And I told his congregation, I said, listen, just hear me. Not all white people are crazy.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to leave it there. But and what I went into or have talked about is, there are those there are white people who want to be part of the solution, because the challenge is, and what I tell my people, we have folks in our church of great influence in the city, and it becomes a justice issue.
Right.
When you're in places of power and authority, and you do nothing to help the situation, the plight of the African American or the poor or whoever that might be. White, Hispanic, otherwise.
Right.
So that's one of the challenges is that I've brought to our people there. But I think back to the message for the African American, I think is to continue to be gracious and forgiving, and that's all that I have found when I've come among my brothers and gone into the African American churches, particularly Concord Church. Just so much grace that comes my way. But that would be the thing: is continue to be patient and humble, and know that not everybody's informed, and then so they need to understand that there are those of us who are working, there are those who are for, helping white folks come along in their understanding.
Now, Brian, one aspect, and you've alluded to this already, is the disruption of African American society that actually lasts for several generations. I mean, one of the typical Anglo response to the situation in the African American society is to say, well, my goodness, there's so much violence and there's so much crime and there's, or it's, there's so much familial dysfunction. And so I suspect that one of the reasons Concord exists to grow people is to try and be a factor in reversing all of this.
Sure.
Explain to our audience how you seek to minister in the midst of this community to try and help from within.
Part of what we believe the gospel calls us to do is this redemptive work that all of us need. Of course, oftentimes, because of economics and because of just societal issues, African American families can sometimes be at the very core end of that, and so that's where we work. That's where we do ministry. That we serve families and we rebuild and we restore and we strengthen and we provide healing and we provide hope. And so that's what we do. We're very involved in the community in every different aspect that we possibly can be, whether that's mass incarceration or prison ministry or mentoring or in the educational process or serving through a food pantry. We just believe that the gospel calls us to bring about restoration. And at the same time, we feel like reconciliation is an important part of that, which means that partnerships with other churches and trying to find ways that we can do this work together is crucial, because sometimes, although we may have, particularly in Dallas, although Southern Dallas may have Southern Dallas has some challenges. North Dallas may have greater resources. That's just the way our city is structured. So how can we work together to really bring about the transformation and the change and the hope and the help that's needed in our community? So that's every day. That's what we're trying to do.
I think, and that's why it's critical for the white leaders, pastors in particular, to take that step, make that first step. And we've learned to go when we've had meetings and such. Go there.
Right.
Don't ask our brothers to come to where we are. Go there.
So where does this sit now? You've met with the pastors for a while. They've exchanged, and I imagine, are there any other pairings that have happened along the lines of what you guys have done?
It's been amazing. Some of the unseen things, Brian and I have talked about this. Often in ministry, you're, Lord, please, Moses, show us your glory. Move. We feel like we've been trying to chase him during this time. And not that it hadn't been challenging and difficult, but we really have been. One of the great gifts has been, as we've come together, you might imagine, and this would be different for different churches of different sizes, but we've come together. Our staff has come to know each other. My executive pastor has a best friend in his executive pastor now. Our communication guys, our worship teams have had to work together. And that, again, challenging. Because we're different, ways of how we worship and come together. So that's been a great benefit. We've had our men who've come together. Our men have gone there a couple times. Their men have come to us. We had a room full of 500 men, of our men their men, talking about racial reconciliation as we spoke from the platform there, and then they spoke at tables. We've had women who have had a book swap. And have read books together and then shared together. We had a kids swap at one point, so it's gone, and more we've sought to bring more pastors into the pulpit swap, which we're going to do again next year.
So the first year, the two of us swapped pulpits, and then this past Palm Sunday we had 18 churches, 9 white, 9 black, that swapped all of us on the same day.
Oh wow!
And then our hope is to add more next year, but just our hope is to really just build those bridges and watch. And so when we did that with those 18 churches, listening to those pastors talk about how the churches received it, what was the conversation like. The goal is to model for our churches what the scriptures teach us about racial reconciliation, to help our churches understand that the matter of racial reconciliation is not going to be accomplished by the schools or the government. If the church doesn't step into that space, it'll never happen. We'll continue to have the proliferation of negative events. So the church has to own that. And so that's what we're trying to raise up our churches to understand that's your role on your workplace, in your neighborhood, at the school. Understand that's your role. You're a reconciler.
And the immediate impact of that, I think, is that there is a testimony that comes out of that you can't, it's not a public relations move. It's so counter to what is going on in the larger world that it just stands out by default.
That's right.
So I think that's a interesting way to deal with this. Well, let me try a couple of other questions here. And remember that we are, even though we're in Dallas, there are the people listening to us all around the country.
Sure.
So what advice would you give, maybe there's a pastor or church leader somewhere listening going, this sounds interesting, but it sure sounds tricky.
Sure.
What advice would you give for getting started, or what you do with someone who feels an inkling, I might want to think about this? And also, not only what advice would you give, but what pitfalls do you need to be aware of as you think about this? And Brian, I'll let you start with that one.
So I think, first of all, if I'm a pastor and I'm thinking about, what can I do for my city? I think, first of all, you've got to look for, I think it helps to have another brother to go with you. So find, whether it's a black brother, white brother, Latino brother, just find another brother and just say, just begin the relationship there. And I think it starts there. And then from there, then I think, then you talk about, what can we do with our churches together? Can we do a service project together? Is there a common need in the city we could serve together around? It's about relationships. It really is. So I think just starting there, and know that when you step into the relationship, that it may work, it may not, and that's okay. It may click, it may not, and I think you got to be open to that, because it doesn't always. When we were approaching the pulpit swaps and we're trying to connect churches, this church, I mean, it's like matchmaking. I mean, you're trying to figure out, is this guy going to work with this? And so it's okay if it doesn't work. It's okay if it's challenging. And I think the leader has to be patient. He has to know it may not happen overnight, but couple of lunches, a couple of connections, and then let's figure out how we can do it, then I think the leader has to also think broadly. Okay, what does this mean? How can we, in a more tangible way, enlarge that reach? And so those are kind of the approaches we've taken to kind of walk through this, and just made it a part of who we are. It's been a part. We have to be very, very intentional. I think that's another core tool.
It's not something you do on the side. It's something you really got to be committed to.
You got to be committed to it because you're too busy. You got too much. Yeah, you got a lot of things going on. So you got to say, this is going to be a priority. I'm going to give some time and energy once a quarter lunch, 1 or 2 projects a year. Otherwise, it just won't happen.
Have you guys ever taught? I want to ask you the same question. Let me do that first before I ask the next question. So what advice would you give, and what are the pitfalls that you see?
Yeah, real quick, Brian's done a good job there. What we realized was that it wasn't as easy, maybe. Like this first time out, we thought, man, we got 50 churches. That was kind of what I was thinking. We're going to go to 100 next year. And what you discover, and I guess this should not have been a surprise, no wonder it's not happening. Well, it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's difficult for all these reasons he said. But one is, you would hope, and guys have asked us, hey, how are we supposed to connect with another pastor? And we'd say, pick up the phone, or go knock on its door and take him to lunch. Yeah. But truthfully, that's how it happens.
It's a 10-digit dial or an email.
Because they looked to us to like how you'll match us up. And I think that's for anyone that's listening right now, any pastor, leader. Take that step. Take that step. And it might be that the first brother you come to say, wow, we didn't connect as friends. I love him, but go to the next one, Right. And I think just be diligent in that until finally you'll find someone, and then the trust grows. Then you can move forward.
Have you guys discussed? I'm kind of transitioning now to where you go from here. But have you guys ever discussed having a joint service, bringing your congregations together at the same time, and having you share a pulpit and a message together?
Right after our first time, a million ideas came out, and people were saying, "What's next?" That was the cool thing.
This was my next question. What are the next steps?
Well, if guys will take this step, I'm telling you, it's happening in every one of it. But the first time we did a pulpit swap, our people are walking out of the services saying, "What are we doing next? When are we going to do this again?"
Right.
And some have said, I've heard this, and Brian could speak to our staff and others, thinking, how cool would it be to have an event where we come, either together at one place or into some larger arena or place where we could come together.
We can do it.
Right. So that's. So the 2 times we've swapped, we've had to ask the question. Okay, what do we do now?
Right.
Do we have like A through Z come to A through M, and you bring in? How do we mix this up?
I'm just a G now.
Right. So we're trying to figure out how do we intermingle? How do we? So we haven't quite figured it out yet. We may have to find another venue where we can bring our churches on that day. But we think we just think it'd be great to see that pitch. Our choirs have been that they've shared space together. So watching them sing together has been neat.
Amazing.
But you're right. It's just every year you're just trying to figure out, okay, what's a fresh way to continue to connect the hearts of the people.
And more of our people this time swapped. They said, I'm going down there this time. Now Brian's got his entourage comes with him. And then I have some folks, but this time we had a lot more of our people come because they've now developed relationships.
Right.
One of the things that happened out of this, we got a men's group that meets every week. A discipleship group of our guys that said, let's do this. And they've become best of friends. It's incredible.
We worked in West Dallas for a while out of the church that I'm in, and one of the things that they did was to produce an intramural sports league in which teams were playing against. Now, you talk about bringing the best and worst out of people at the same time, but there were relationships that grew out of that because after year, you're playing the same teams with the same guys. I knew a guy who could take me down deep into the post, little guy that I am, and beat me to a drum, but we got to know each other and encourage one another and that kind of thing. And there are all kinds of possibilities for what can be done.
One of the next steps we did this year, we added. We thought, hey, why don't we serve together? And so the step out of the pulpit swap was everyone involved then come get involved in what we call Transform Dallas. It's just a few weeks after our pulpit swap. And I've been told, and I believe it was, an historic day. It was a Saturday where we had 130 projects, nearly 4,000 plus people from churches, not just from the pulpit swaps, but ministries that we're involved in throughout the year. Both of our churches are very active in the city, as Brian mentioned, and many ministries. So kind of came together, and we sent people to places where they didn't normally always go. So our people were down in South Dallas, other places around Fair Park, Southern Sector. A lot of his folks were around, and other churches jumped in on that.
Because the hope is the swap happens, the day of service, the swap pushes and promotes the day. This is our next step. And then out of that, we have several other things we've thought about. One of them is a Bible study curriculum. Just a 4-week, either a preaching series or small group series that we're still working through that churches could use. So that potentially when we do the swap, maybe next year, he launches it. We all launch the same series, and then we begin studying that together in the life of our churches. Because we just believe that if we can keep taking these next steps of and then enlarging those involved, then we really can make some progress to help our hearts understand what God's called us on us. And together, we're also excited. We're going to be in Charleston in June for the anniversary of that tragedy there. And they're planning works around that about how there's national movements that are happening around this matter of racial reconciliation. So it's just important that every leader understands, what does this look like for me, and how do I advance this work?
Well, this is obviously a story to be continued. That we're kind of at this point in the journey, and I'm sure there's more coming, and we'll keep our eye on it and have you guys back to talk about the rest of the story. I thank y'all for coming in and introducing this.
It's been great to be with
folks, and we appreciate the fact that you have come to be a part of the table. We look forward to having you back with us again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. For more podcasts like this one, visit dts.edu/the table. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.